one of the ways that you can kind of build some comfort into preparing for a big exam like this is understanding how the people at College Board actually construct the test. And I can share that with you. This is not secret information. This is just um, it's information that happens to be buried in a document that's over 300 pages long. And so my job is to kind of help you not have to read 300 pages to kind of figure out how they put things together. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what College Board is going to want you to do, and we're going to practice, right? We're going to play around with how to um, sort of how to create the form that College Board readers are looking for when they're looking at a short answer question or you know, an essay question. So I'm sort of that's a really good question. Two things that I'm trying to balance here is kind of the mechanics of how to write for the AP US History and AP World exam, but also the thinking that is going to get you the highest points, because you can have really good structure of an essay, but if it doesn't have meat to it, if it doesn't have the historical thinking that they're looking for, it's not going to be the highest scoring, you know, that's possible.
Mm.
So I'm going to try to balance those two things out. And kind of your job in this class is to give me feedback on if that's working. And so we'll like I said, we need to kind of know what our opponent is, and then we can start figuring out how well we're being prepared um, to deal with that opponent.
Mhm.
Adversary? I don't know. What's a good word? I don't want to turn it into a. It's not a conflict, right? It's our challenge. How's that? We'll use a nice a word
Mhm.
like that. All right. So let's start. I'm going to do a little introduction here to historical thinking. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take a look at these three images that we have in front of you. The first thing I want to say is there is no right or wrong answer here. Not interested in right and wrong for this one. So figure A shows us an arrow with A, B, C, D. Does that best represent history in your mind? Figure B shows like event A, event B, moving in a cyclical motion for figure B. And then figure C um, gives us arrows pointing out from a central location to A, to B, to C, to D. And so I'm going to ask you an unfair question, which is, of these three, which one of them best represents history to you? And then think about why. Can you actually, if you pick figure A, can you apply historical situation to figure A? If you pick B, can you do the same thing? And can you do the same with figure C? I mean, I'm not saying it's a one for one, but that is kind of interesting, right? That you picked the one figure that suggests multiple perspectives, right? Um, Yeah, and if you go back to our earlier conversation, right, we're going to have a big old celebration here on Friday, July 4th, here in the United States, and the rest of the world's going to be like, meh, you know,
Mm.
everybody's got an Independence Day of some type, right? You know, good for you. Um, and yet you could take something else, right? Think about something like Christmas, right?
Mhm.
I mean, it's not celebrated everywhere in the world, but it's celebrated in more parts of the world than, say, American independence. Um, US independence, I should say, is there. Um,
Mhm.
so I like the fact that you brought up the American Revolution, because obviously there were a lot of different perspectives, you know, as people were responding to, you know, particular events, you know, Lexington and Concord, right? You have a shooting that's taking place, and British soldiers and American colonists, you know, being killed. And, you know, people thought, you know, very differently. I like it. All right. Kelvin, which one did you go with?
Well, so figure A is linear and figure B, I think, is cyclical. Yeah, it's, I think that's the word, since it's like, and I believe in figure B because I believe history repeats itself. Like, for example, rise and fall of empires.
Okay.
That's just my argument. That's it. That's why I think figure B.
That is certainly a a powerful argument, right? Um, there's the famous expression often attributed to George Santayana, American um, philosopher, if we have such a thing, that those who do not know the past are doomed to repeat that. I don't think he has complete control of that particular quote, but the quote pops up, over and over again. And we do see similarities. That this is one of the things when I use that word consilience, right? When you look at all of the disciplines that are out there, whether it's a humanities like U.S. history or the study of history, or it's a hard science even, mathematics. One of the commonalities between all of them is patterns, right? We look for patterns and then we try to figure out, are they real patterns, right? Because we sometimes jump to conclusions, and then we try to figure out why those patterns, exist. Um, just since y'all took B and C, I'll take A, right? I think A also could represent history. It is linear, right? And if there's one thing we know about time, time is a one-way street, right? So far, I haven't seen any evidence that we've either been able to stop time or go back in time. Those two things haven't happened. And so, in some ways, history is us trying to figure out um, a linear kind of narrative, even though it might be in some ways repeating itself, and in some ways we might see it from different perspectives. There is kind of a constant there, which is that things continue to move in a direction from past to the present moment that we're in, and to this future, right? That keeps coming at us and hitting us, um, like we got the window down in the car. Um, all three of these images are valid models that we might use to help us to kind of understand what's happening in history. I'm sure in some course that you've taken, you ended up doing a timeline, right? And interestingly, why would your teacher in a history class have you do a timeline? What would be the value in doing a timeline? So, one of the things that we've been as social creatures, right, is that we're storytellers, right? And we're story listeners. We do that as well. And it's really interesting that if you go, around the world at different times and different cultures, one of the things you find as a commonality is storytelling, right? Being able to put things into some sort of story form. And certainly a linear form like this is one that is easier to follow. It also helps us to engage in a type of historical skill, right? Which is cause and effect. Joanna, this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier. This idea that something can happen, in this particular moment can lead to something else, can lead to something else. And all of those things I think are true. And sometimes it's important to know the order in which things take place, because that gives us a deeper understanding, of what's happening in a particular moment. Yeah. Figure B, the idea. So Kelvin, you think history repeats itself? Give me a little more on that. What do you mean by that? History repeats itself. You mentioned the rise and fall of empires.
Well, I feel like there are many like similarities in like different like rise and falls of empires, and they follow like a kind of like a similar structure on how they rose and how they fell. Maybe through like, for example, like propaganda. Maybe propaganda could be the rise, and economic failure, which is in a lot of cases for
And
a lot of different like
but
empires.
I love, when I pressed you a little bit, you were like, similarities, right? Because you
Yeah.
also argue their differences as well.
Yep.
And I think that's another one of the historical skills that we're going to be looking at, is we're going to be looking at historical moments and looking at the similarities and looking at the differences between the two. And those become powerful, right? If you think about some of the greatest empires that are out there, they try to build on this idea that they didn't come from nothing, that they came out of some sort of historical background, right? That gives credence and reason for why they are becoming an empire. today. It's not the only reason. There are other things, right? In the United States, we were going to talk about this concept of manifest destiny, that it's somehow the destiny of Americans to spread from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, across this quote unquote empty land, right? And then that, Joanna, kind of goes back to storytelling, right? Americans are telling themselves in the 1840s and the 1850s that they're spreading out into an empty land. Whereas the Cheyenne and the Sioux peoples right on the plains are like, no, it's not. It's actually, it's full of us, as full as, we want it to be. And so I think one of the other things that when we're studying history, we're seeing these different narratives and conflict with each other. I mean, Kelvin, you even use the term propaganda, right? What does that word mean? When I say propaganda, why would we use it in relationship with history?
Well, so for like a definition, I can't really give you like an exact definition of
That's fine.
propaganda,
Yeah.
but I believe it's advertisement and like maybe even false news like against the objective like party and to like raise awareness and support of the their own respective party.
Yeah, it has a point of view, right? But all
Yeah.
propaganda, whether it's kind of negative or positive, and it can be positive, it does have a message, right? It has something. One of the things that I think about, you think about the root of the word propaganda. It's like prop. It's like props in a movie or props in a play, right? They're using these things to try to convince you of a reality, that is out there. And often the narratives are the things, these stories, these different groups who are trying to tell their particular side of the story end up in an actual power clash with each other. History isn't just stuff that happened in the past. It's just not a class you have to take to pass, to get credit for, your school. It's also a way that we operate as social creatures, right? Being able to tell these stories. And we love to say, my history, going back to the important stories, my history is the correct history and it's the important history. Your history is wrong. And that becomes immensely powerful. And I think it's always important to understand that when we study any history, US history, world history, that there's a lot of power in how we put together the idea of what happened in the past. And that becomes a way of influencing, how people act. And I never move away from that, right? I'm going to suggest that these three models, we're not going to use any one of them, but instead, we'll use all three of them at different times as we're kind of structuring things. Sometimes, Kelvin, we'll be doing it very pragmatically, right? We're just trying to tell a story. We're trying to remember stuff, right? And put it into, a narrative form. Sometimes we'll be looking for cause and effect. Sometimes we'll be looking for similarities and differences. Joanna, sometimes we'll be looking for perspectives, right? What if we change how we look at this particular historical story? Does that give us a more complex view, of what's going on? Excellent. All right. Well, here are three ideas, and I will come back to these every time we meet as a class. I try to remind students of this. Um, Three ideas to help you to think like a historian. Idea number one: history is stories with evidence. Um, we both world history and US history are general survey courses, and so what that means is they don't do deep dives right into any one particular time period. Instead, they do more of a surface area broad view of what's going on. And so I think it's always important in the back of your mind when you're going over some US history to realize that there probably are other points of view that you could be looking at, another person's perspective that you can be bringing in. It's also important to realize that even though we are telling stories like you would in an English class, for example, that these are not fiction in the sense of we get to make stuff up. These are fiction, but they have to be backed up by sources. You have to have evidence to be able to back those up. Idea number two that we're going to come back to over and over and over again. And if you end up taking an AP English exam or composition, you'll also see this particular structure. And that's why when we're looking at answering questions and discussing history, we should think in terms of claim, evidence, and reasoning. I need to be able to make a claim or recognize a claim. I need to be able to gather evidence that is apropos to the claim. And then I need to explain how that evidence either backs the claim up or challenges the claim, as the case may be. So whenever you're writing, whether it's a short answer question or a long essay or a document-based question, you're always thinking claim, evidence, reasoning, right? I want to make sure I'm hitting all three of those as I'm moving down. And then idea number three, context equals description. So if you're asked to give the context of a historical moment or historical event, you're describing who was there, what were they doing, why were they there, right? These types of things. And then significance, we ask this in terms of explanation. That is, if you have, for example, in August of 1941, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, meeting with the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. What were they doing? Why were they meeting? And then when you ask yourself, why is this important? What does this tell us about what's going on in history? In this case, specifically dealing with with World War II. Then that becomes another level here, right? I can describe who was there, but I need to be able to explain why that was important as well, why that particular description was important. So history is stories, but with evidence. We have to have evidence to back them up. Now we need to get into our mindset, claim, evidence, reasoning. Whenever I make a claim or I engage with a claim, what's the evidence? What's the reasoning behind it? And then context equals description. So I'm describing. And then significance equals explanation. This is important because this shows us, what's happening in this particular moment in history. Now let me explain it to you. It is a really good idea that if someone tells you, here is a learning objective, and what that is the thing they want you to learn. How are we doing there? Right? And when you read something like this, like I know you kind of glaze over, but it's important to kind of look at the language that's being used. Explain. So again, that's significance, right? I'm looking at why something is important. How and why environmental and other factors shape the development and expansion of various British colonies. Now hold on here. I'm not even going to ask you American history here. I'm going to ask you some Canadian history here, right? Oh yeah. All right. Don't freak out here, right? When the French were deciding to set up their colony there along the St. Lawrence, what is it that they were trying to make money off of? Uh-oh.
Trade?
Trade in what? You're absolutely right. There's something specific along these rivers that they wanted to trade for.
Gold.
Oh, fur, right?
Exactly. Hold on. So hold on. So that's different though. If you look at the major rivers, right, that in what becomes the 13 English colonies that are going to be settled and eventually become the United States, you do see fur trading, but it's not nearly as important, right? And a large part of that has to do with the fact that the French, one, they needed to make fast money, right? But also they found themselves in a system where fur trading was already easily available to them. So they had an environmental factor, lots of beaver around there. They were in a climate where you could grow crops, but it was certainly not as conducive to growing crops as you're going to find down in the middle and southern colonies of the United States. And so the French make a decision, right? We're going to develop strong relationships with local Native American nations, the Huron, for example, and we're going to trade for fur, right? So explain how and why environmental and other factors help shape the development and expansion of various British colonies. As soon as you know that fur is part of the story of what becomes the British colony eventually of Canada, then it helps you to understand why this particular area developed the way that it did. And my point here is that when you start looking at these learning objectives, there seem to be a whole lot of them. But if you think about I'm preparing to take an exam in May of 2026. And if you start thinking now about looking at each of the learning objectives, there are a finite number of them. They are not infinite, they are finite. And so if you can start looking at the objectives and saying, hey, I understand that one. I know what's being asked for there. I can remember some stories that go along with it, 2 or 3 of them. Then you can start putting that on your I'm prepared for this shelf, and you can start eliminating. One of the things that I try to get across to students is one of your number one jobs is figuring out what you don't need to study. Because if you spend a lot of time going back and studying stuff that you already know, good for you, but it's also kind of a time suck, especially when you have all these other courses that you're taking, other exams that you're preparing for. So if you can start systematically figuring out how do I create, a sort of a checklist, right, of how I can go through and know the stuff that I need to know. I'm going to take a moment and I'll give you I'll give you a link to it because I know it's going to come up backwards here. But I'm holding up this review book. It's from a company called AMSCO, AMSCO, AMSCO. And I highly recommend it to my students because it's a U.S. history review, and there's a world history version of it too. But what it does is it breaks down the review into each of these learning objectives so that you can kind of go through and start checking off and saying, hey, I know this particular story. Kelvin, you mentioned the Boston Tea Party, right? So if you know something about the Boston Tea Party, you already have a piece of evidence that can help you with part of U.S. history. So you can go to the CED, you can go to the learning objective and say, hey, where can I plug this piece of evidence into the CED so that I can be able to answer most of the questions they're going to ask me based on that particular learning objective. Does that make sense?
Kinda, but I'm still kind of like a little confused on like what do you mean like implement into the CED? Like you just take this one piece of information and use it like in
Well, look at the one that we had here, right? It says explain how and why environmental and other factors shaped the development and expansion of various British colonies that developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754, right? So one piece of evidence that you were able to think about was fur, right? And the fur trade. So as soon as you have that particular piece of evidence, you're like, hey, I can use that piece of evidence to address this particular claim because that's what this is, right? Explain how and why environmental and other factors. As soon as you say, the cold climate of, what becomes Canada was one of the things that leads to more of an investment in the fur trade, more of an investment in things like shipbuilding and fishing, right? That also go along with it. Then you're going to be in pretty good shape for any question that College Board asks you that's going to be based on this learning objective. Does that make sense? So
yeah, that
basically,
makes sense.
they give you the battle plan, right? They I keep using these combative things. But they give you their playbook, right? They're like, these objectives are what we use when we create all of our questions, whether they're multiple choice, short answer, or essay. And so if you can understand the learning objective and you have evidence that fits the learning objective, helps to explain the learning objective, then you're going to set yourself up to be able to answer any question they ask you. And I think that sort of Sun Tzu, know your enemy, right? Know who you're up against. And College Board doesn't try to play cat and mouse. They're not trying to trick you. They're not trying to pull something up that you don't know. Any teacher that's doing that, that's not teaching. That's just being evil, right? At that point, what they're trying to do is they're trying to ask you questions in such a way as you can demonstrate what you know about the topic. And one of the ways that you can do that systematically is by taking a look at each of these learning objectives, right? And then they give you how you can break these down, right? They give you, like over here, historical developments. They give you more specific particulars that you might be able to use to address that particular learning objective. Right. We're going to go in more detail. You don't have to master all of this right now, but I just want to give you a taste of this because once you figure out that College Board, the people who make the exam, have provided you with the basis for how they make the exam, then it's in your best interest to then dive into that, even if it is a bit big and meaty. But to kind of figure out how you can go through and sort of organize this in a way that is most useful. Yeah, I'm going to leave that for right now. They also provide you with written explanations for how they write their questions. They'll walk you through, and we'll look at some of these late in the coming weeks. They will also give you, like in this CED, they will give you test questions that you can practice on. You can kind of look at and figure out. And then one of the other things that they do, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but all of the free response questions that College Board uses, not all of them, a set or two of the questions that they use, they publish on their website for free for everyone. So, Kelvin, you said history repeats itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got decades of essay questions that College Board has asked in the past that you can analyze to kind of get a sense of how College Board likes to ask questions. I know it's very circular, right? But you get to use your skills as a historian to study for your history exam.
All right, I got it.
Is AP US history like when you take the when you take the AP test? I know that some AP tests you have to attach a document for the free response. Is AP US one of them, or?
The over the past couple of years, both AP World and AP US have been digitized. So there are some caveats to that, but for my students in the standard course that I teach for AP US history, everything they need is in that digital format. So they don't need to attach any files to it or things like that. It's all in the College Board
Oh,
format.
okay, I see.
Yeah. Now there are still some exceptions with some written portions for some of the exams. They're hybrid exams, like calculus, for example. I'm not that familiar with them though. I wouldn't be able to
Okay.
speak very well to that. All right. So we just dipped our toes into the CED. We'll dig in a little more detail, but I do want you to know that this is again a document that College Board provides you that ought to be one that you get familiar with so that you can be best prepared for the exam. Well, we've been doing a lot of yapping here, so let's do some work. So one of the things I want to introduce you to is a model that you can use to approach primary sources. Let me check in on this real quick. Primary and secondary sources. Have y'all come across this terminology in your history classes? What's a primary source? No?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
a primary
Yeah.
first-hand source.
Yeah, it's a good way. Yeah, firsthand. So a primary source means that it comes from the time period or from someone who experienced the time period. So there could be a little bit of a gray area between them. Somebody writes a memoir, that could be considered a primary source, even though it might have some problems. And then a secondary source is something that is derived after, right? So a textbook, for example, would be secondary. It's a narrative with interpretations of primary sources that you can go to. So one of the things that College Board is going to be asking you to do for AP US History and World is to understand how to approach primary sources. So what we're going to use here, and there are many versions of this. This is not the only one that's out there. So you'll see different iterations of this, but they're basically the same thing. This is the happy model for analyzing, and I kind of want to punch myself when I say something like that because it sounds a little too Disney for my particular taste, but it is the happy model here. And so what the happy model says is when I look at a primary source, one of the things I want to be able to do is figure out the historical context. Remember, context is description, right? So you're kind of describing what's going on around the document, right? What's going on in that time period, who's involved and what's happening. So when and where was the document created and what events shaped it? How does the time and place affect the document's message and impact? The A stands for audience. Who was the document intended for? If you can identify it, sometimes that's more difficult than you would think. But who was the audience for the document, and how does this affect its validity? Kelvin, go back to this concept of propaganda, right? Propaganda is a type of information. It is designed to convince someone of a particular point of view. And if you could figure out that what you're looking at is propaganda, then as a historian, you kind of step back and say, well, I got to be careful with this, right? Because this person wasn't just providing, an open, honest amount of information. They were putting this information in such a way to try to convince people of, the point of view. And sometimes if you can figure out who the audience is, you can figure that out. Purpose, this kind of goes along with audience. What was the author's motivation for creating the document? How does this affect its validity and reliability? Point of view, who created the document and what details in the document reflect the author's perspective? This is a big one that comes up all the time. College Board loves to ask perspective questions. So Joanna, I think you're going to be mostly happy with with those types of approaches. It gives you an opportunity to kind of think about, hey, who's writing this and what point of view are they coming from? How does the author's background and role in society affect their perspective? And then the why and happy why. What is the document's main idea and why is it important to history? How does this document relate to the prompt or the thesis? So if you look at the HAPP, those are kind of those fall under the more descriptive side, right? And then why is the significance? Why is this important? What does this tell us as historians? All right, you ready to put this to the test? I was like, are you asking me to be honest right now at 7:55 at night? Let's put this to the test. Let me put it differently. Let's put this to the test here. There's a link. Native Americans discover Europeans. Christian Leclerc, 1676. I'm already gotten some information here. So what I'd like for us to do, let's go through the document first. And I'm going to go through the document, but as I'm doing that, you're thinking about the happy model here, right? Well, how to fill in the pieces of the happy model. Digital History, by the way, is a free resource that you can find on the web that provides not only primary sources like this one, which this is, but they also provide secondary narrative sources for history as well. It's one of the many free resources that you can get your hands on that are very useful. So I told you the AMSCO review book was good. Okay, that's something you might have to pay for if you decide to get it. But I'm also going to show you there's a lot of free stuff out there as well that's also very useful. So that AP US history can be at your price level that you decide on what you want to put in. So I've got who's talking here. I've got a name at least. I don't necessarily know who this person is. I've got a date, 1676. All right, hold on here. So Kelvin, you told me that the first English colonies were when? The permanent ones.
Oh, early 1600s?
So this is 1676, right? The French were right close behind the British in terms of establishing their first colonies. So this isn't the very beginning, right? This is after the colonies have been around for at least a few generations. And here, I get an annotation, which I don't always get for primary sources, but I get an annotation that says a French missionary relates the response of a Micmac chief to French criticisms of his people's way of life. Okay, so right off the bat here, I need to be careful. What I am reading is a French missionary relating what a Native American speaker said. How are we doing? That should make me be thinking all right off the bat. So the person speaking here is not the French missionary, but instead this Micmac chief. We're good on that front? All right. So here's what this Micmac chief said, according to this French missionary. I am greatly astonished that the French have so little cleverness. Oh, look, we get a chance to make fun of the French. Don't do this very often, certainly. Toronto, you can get away with it, right? Quebec,
Oh, for sure, for sure, for sure.
okay. As they seem to exhibit in the matter of which thou hast just told me on their behalf, in the effort to persuade us to convert our poles, our barks, and our wigwam into those houses of stone and of wood which are tall and lofty, according to their account, as these trees. Very well. But why now do men of 5 to 6 feet in height need houses which are 60 to 80? Hast thou as much ingenuity and cleverness as the Indians, who carry their houses and their wigwams with them, so that they may lodge wheresoever they please, independently of any seigneur whatsoever? Thou sayest of us also that we are the most miserable and unhappy of all men, living without religion, without manners, without honor, without social order, and, in a word, without any rules. Like the beast in our woods and our forests, lacking bread, wine, and 1,000 other comforts which thou hast in superfluity in Europe. I beg thee now to believe that, all miserable as we seem in thine eyes, we consider ourselves nevertheless much happier than thou in this, that we are very content with the little that we have, and believe also once for all, I pray, that thou deceivest thyself greatly if thou thinkest to persuade us that thy country is better than ours. For if France, as thou sayest, is a little terrestrial paradise, art thou sensible to leave it? Now tell me this one thing. If thou hast any sense, which of these two is the wisest and happiest? He who labors without ceasing and only obtains, and that with great trouble, enough to live on, or he who rests in comfort and finds all that he needs in the pleasure of hunting and fishing? All right. What's our first challenge here besides worrying about happy?
Is this reliable?
We have to ask that. What makes you suspicious, if anything?
Well, he's speaking in Elizabeth English, I believe.
So we have a French missionary relating a Micmac chief, and the source is in English. Right? So already off the bat, even if the person writing this down is as honest as the day is long, it doesn't mean they got things down correctly. Right? So there may be some issues in there that we have to worry about. All right. What else do we need to think about in terms of this document?
To make fun of like French people.
Yeah,
and
why
to,
though? On what grounds is this Micmac chief, or at least according to the document, going after the French?
well, he like somewhat goes against what the French people believe. And for example, it's stated somewhere that said that they don't live with honor, with religion, but instead they are like, instead they like, the Micmac chief obviously believes that the French are actually the miserable ones, and it's kind of like somewhat, I guess, hypocritical for the French people to say that about the indigenous, and I think that's what the message is trying to be.
Okay, so you walked around a couple of different ways there, right, to get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first thing you did, as I noted, right, was you went back in and started picking something out about not having manners. Well, that's what this Micmac chief is saying that the French is saying of the Micmac people, right? Saying that they don't have manners and they don't have religion, they don't have those things. But then you got back to this part where you were like, basically what this Native American chief is saying is that you French are telling us how to live and telling us that if we live like you French people, we're going to be better off. Well, we don't really think so. I don't think you're better off than we are. And he kind of ties that up at the end. One of the problems with a document like this is I need to figure out, one, what is being said. And you did that, right? At the end, this is kind of turning the tables. we are so used to the Europeans coming over into the Americas and saying, look at these, and I'm using language of the time period, right? But look at these savages, look at these uncivilized people. If they want to be civilized, then these indigenous people have to live like we do. They need to adopt our religion. They need to adopt our customs, our way of living in houses, right? Versus in these portable tents and whatnot. And now we have this voice speaking back and saying, I think you're wrong, right? You French people who are coming over here telling us what to do. I think you've got the wrong end of the stick here. And who's actually, really happy. And if you think about it, it's pretty strong there at the end. Hunting and fishing are considered to be hobbies, pastimes, right? In our culture today. And this guy's like, we get to do it all the time. This is our lives. And y'all have to take a Saturday off to go hunting. And we get to live that life. All right, talk to me about a few other things here. What else do you see that might be? Let me ask this question. Do you think, let me be careful how I ask this. Do you think this document, even with the issues that it has, do you think this document accurately reflects the way many indigenous people saw Europeans?
Oh, so it's creating like a stereotype. Maybe like some articles make them look like they're very like harsh and like they are very like aggressive, but sometimes just people just like, oh, I don't really care what they think about me.
So let me go back. So do you think that this accurately reflects how many indigenous people saw the Europeans? So you say yes or no?
No. Oh
No.
no.
So why wouldn't you think this would reflect how Native Americans saw the Europeans? What's making you suspicious?
I feel like maybe there's just some people that are aggressive towards others, and some people might just live their own life and they just don't really care.
Okay, so it's
Not all
possible
the
that
people
this
have the
doesn't.
same thoughts.
So let me ask the question a little bit differently. What would make you more confident that this document accurately reflected how Native Americans saw the Europeans? What would you need to be more confident that this was a valid document?
More facts, like, and more general, like how more general people acted.
And so can I go back and maybe let me change this just a little bit, not just more facts, right? But if you, in addition to this document, if you had more documents from different Native Americans speaking,
Yeah.
right? And Kelvin, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? If I find more documents that express similar points of view, maybe from different places at different times, from different indigenous people, that begins to establish what?
Propaganda? Or
Not propaganda necessarily,
okay.
but if I have more indigenous people saying similar things to what this Micmac chief says, it begins to establish a pattern.
Oh yeah, right. Okay. Silical history. Yeah.
Does that make sense though? And this is kind of the danger of a general survey course, right? We don't have time to look at 100 different primary source documents, right? So what we do instead is we read a textbook that gives us information and takes 100 different documents and then distills it down into a couple of sentences that says, hey, lots of indigenous people didn't buy into the propaganda that the Europeans were spreading, that people living in the Americas ought to be like the Europeans. Instead, they spoke out against this, right? But we read that in a history book and we're kind of like, okay, but we have to realize that underneath that particular distillation of information are hundreds of documents that are there. And so if you think about the way historians write, what they do is they footnote it. Does that make sense? We do this across the hard sciences and the social sciences and the humanities. When we make a statement about something, we make a claim about something, we then say, hey, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's a footnote that will take you to documents that will show you where I got my information from.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're doing here, like looking at a document like this, is we're showing off how we can think about the document, how we might be able to use the document, but we're also thinking about the limitations of the document, that all documents have limitations. How can I make this a better document that would be more trustworthy without 100 more documents similar to it? Well, if I could speak to this Mi'kmaq chief directly in his language, but can you do that?
No.
No.
Nope.
I'm sorry, but necromancy is not one of the things we get into when we teach history, right? We don't learn how to raise the dead so that we can talk to them. It would be, I think it would be useful. I'm not sure actually to be fair. But then what would you do with all the bodies? That would be the biggest problem probably you would have. One of them. So when we're looking at a document like this, we need some type of a structure to help us to kind of organize it. And that's where Happy comes in, right? So if I go back to my Happy here, the historical context here. Well, I would need to maybe dig a little bit into the story behind, French colonization. What's going on in 1676? I know there's some stuff going on in the English colonies in 1676. There's a huge uprising of indigenous people against English colonists. There are some English colonists themselves who were rising up against their own government in 1676, 100 years before the American Revolution. So I could, as I learn more content about the material, that also can help me to kind of figure out whether or not I can trust the document in terms of what it represents. The audience here, well, that's really quite a question, right? Who do you think the audience was of this particular document?
English speaking countries.
Take a look at down at, do y'all see the source down at the bottom? Christian Leclerc, New Relations of Gaspésia with the Customs and Religion of the Gaspésian Indians, 1691. So this was originally, I'm going to posit, written in French in 1691. So this particular person was writing about their experience many, many, many decades later, or publishing it many, many decades later. So who's reading this? Well, initially, if I'm looking at the source information, the people who are reading this initially are people in France. They're the ones who are reading it initially, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, follow me in my logical rant here. You ready? But like you pointed out, Joanna, this is in English. So at some point, this got translated in English. Now, this particular group here, we see in 1910, right? It's coming out. But imagine in the 1670s, 1680s, and 1690s, right? What is the relationship between the English colonists, or between England and their colonies in the Americas, and the French and their colonies in the Americas? What was the relationship between the English and the French when it came to their American colonies? Kelvin, do you remember?
Can you repeat the question again, by any
I
chance?
can. What was the relationship between the French and English when it came to their colonies in the Americas? I'll give you some options, right? Did they trade with each other and get along with each other, or were they in competition with each other?
Oh, they were in competition, I believe.
And like you pointed out, now this is, I want to follow something that you were helping to establish, whether you meant to or not, which is, imagine that this particular exchange, that if you're an Englishman and you got your hands on this, who is this document being critical of? What group of people is this document criticizing?
The French.
And if I'm an Englishman and I get my hands on this, then I can show my other English friends, hey, look, these Micmac people don't like the French. Perhaps
Yep.
people like us better.
Oh.
How are you doing? Y'all good with that?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm making a claim there. I am giving a hypothetical situation. The only way for me to back that up would be to dig through the archives and find more evidence that would help to support that particular claim. All right. Well, we can talk, but let's do some stuff here. Let's do, I want to do two things before we leave. I want to introduce a secondary source and I want to do one primary source outside, just as best we can. So take a look at this secondary source. That Google Doc that you shared with me with your responses to the 5 questions, if you'll go back to that document and take a few minutes here, let's take 4 minutes here, right? I've got 8:14 on my clock here, right? We're good to 8:30, I think is our time when we're cutting off. So let's take 4 minutes here. I've got a secondary source. This means that this is a source that was created from primary sources. It is not itself from the time period. So I'm asking you to describe the information. So if you will, in that Google Doc, if you'll title this Introduction to a Secondary Source, and for the first question here, or the first ask, if you'll put out, a couple of sentences, 2 to 3 sentences here, describing the information, just what are you seeing being provided? And then how could you use this information that is in the secondary source that we see right here? How could you use this information to address the following claim? Contact among Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans resulted in the Columbian Exchange. Well, that works because look at the secondary source. What's the title of it?